Hi everyone, this is Andrew Prima, Ukrainian American, reporting from Kiev. In today's podcast, week 150 of Russian invasion of Ukraine, and this is the third week of 2025. It's actually exactly 1 month before 3-year anniversary of Russian invasion. So in today's podcast, we're going to talk about the recently elected Donald Trump and what he's saying after inauguration and how his rhetoric's changed toward the war in Ukraine, and also Trump's Putin talks. Donald Trump has officially became the US president of the United States. After he made all the promises, let's see what he says now about ending the war within 24 hours. Donald Trump has already backed down from his claims that he would handle the Ukraine conflict within 24 hours of taking office. Trump's advisors have now admitted that the war in Ukraine is simply not going to end through negotiations. Trump's art of the deal doesn't really work in the real world of conflict resolutions. Trump's initial plan was to provide Ukraine with additional military aid to ensure that it would deter further Russian aggression, that would incentivize it to come to the negotiating table. Another possible tactic was to cut off aid to Ukraine to force it to negotiate. Immediately after the start of the peace talks, Trump plans to call on Ukraine to return to the territories it has seized to Russia and seized an 800-mile demilitarized buffer zone to be patrolled by NATO or European troops. On the issue of NATO, Trump is sympathetic to Russian dictator Putin, view that Ukraine's accession to NATO is a threat to Russian security. Ukraine will therefore have to give up its dreams of ever joining the regional security bloc. Russia, in turn, will receive significant sanctions relief, and some of the revenue from tariffs on Russian energy exports will go to Ukraine. Trump's peace plan was developed by the future social special envoy for Russia and Ukraine, Keith Kellogg, actually a retired three-star general who recently canceled an upcoming trip to Kiev. Despite this, Trump has signaled that he wants to engage in diplomatic talks with Putin to end the war. We all should understand that Putin doesn't want to make a deal. While this plan faces many obstacles, the biggest one is that Putin doesn't really want to make a deal or negotiate. In October, Russia was losing 1,500 troops a day, and the country has struggled and continues to struggle with recruitment. The Russian economy has suffered under an onslaught of sweeping sanctions, while tens of billions of dollars are being spent on defense at the expense of other government spendings. But none of that matters because Putin is obsessed with Ukraine and total victory. Russia could even face a recession, as predicted to many experts in 2025, which still wouldn't be enough for the Kremlin to agree to any deal involving compromise. Putin simply doesn't want Ukraine to be a sovereign state. He wants to either destroy it or fully control it. A week of non existent Ukraine is not only a boon to Putin's legacy as a strong Russian leader, but it would also be a huge blow to American global power. Not surprisingly, Russia has already rejected these unofficial US proposals, although it has yet to see an official document on the matter. Putin prefers to be a wartime president, and many Russians are willing to live in the new normal, where they are threatened by repression and motivated by patriotism. So Russia doesn't believe it needs to compromise. Putin knows that he's far more committed to taking over Ukraine than the West to protecting it. there are certain signs in Europe of fatigue from endless support for Ukraine. According to several polls that were done in 2024 out of the seven European countries, such as France, Italy, Spain, Germany, the UK, Sweden, and Denmark, which shows that support for Ukraine until Russia withdraws its troops averaged at just 31%, while about 40% support in negotiated cessation of hostilities, even if Ukraine loses territory. There is also fatigue among lawmakers and the public in the United States. Thus, providing additional weapons to Ukraine could face resistance in Congress, which is now completely controlled by the Republican Party. Support for Ukraine has already faced Republican opposition in 2023, if you remember, when they tried to pass $61 billion bill in aid of Ukraine, and it dragged for about 6 7 months. And as you saw, it was finally approved, but the huge delay actually had a massive negative effect on the Ukraine counteroffensive. And while the Biden administration recently announced a new tranche of military aid worth of $500 million right before he left the office, out of the total of $175 billion announced since 2022 invasion, support for maintaining the level of aid to Ukraine has won among Republicans in Congress. However, if you remember, according to President Zelensky, out of all this $175 billion promised, only $88 billion of promised aid actually arrived in Ukraine. And this also includes all the military contracts that US defense companies concluded in making the weapons for Ukraine. So half of the promised aid has never arrived. And this is a huge amount. And this amount could have been, if this amount could have been allocated as it was promised, maybe Ukraine would have had a better position at the front lines. So this largely reflects the sentiment of the American public. According to several polls conducted in December 2024, 48% support the US helping Ukraine regain territory it lost in the war, the first time that figure has fallen. Support for Ukraine is also very divided along party lines, with 74% of Republicans and 30% of Democrats wanting a quick end to the war. In addition, 67% of Republicans believe the US is doing too much for Ukraine, which is very alarming for Ukraine and its allies. Ultimately, a peace deal is unlikely to happen anytime soon, as Trump has little interest in Ukraine or understanding of foreign policy. Former Republican Congressman Adam Kinzinger recently said that Trump is conducting foreign policy like a three year old. Trump is more concerned with impressing Putin or being seen as a party to the deal than he is with upholding Ukraine's sovereignty. His Vice President J.D. Vance was more direct about this, stating in 2024 that I have to be honest with you, I don't care what happens to Ukraine one way or another. Such a view could have a devastating impact on the willingness and commitment to negotiate. Trump's initial claim that he would resolve the Ukraine crisis in 24 hours were campaign propaganda. It demonstrated a poor understanding of the conflict's intractability and the challenges of forming a new administration. A few weeks ago, Trump said that part of his plan is a surprise. The element of surprise doesn't just apply to the public. Trump may also have no idea what his next step will be when it comes to ending this conflict, and that could play into Putin's hands. So, just a few hours before Trump's inauguration, Putin held a meeting with the parliament members of the Russian Security Council, then congratulated Donald Trump and declared that he was ready to conduct an equal and mutually respectful dialogue with the Trump administration. Putin, in principle, said nothing new. He's masking his unwavering intentions to destroy Ukraine with some new praises of taking into account the rights of nations and people. If we talk about what we learn from new Trump's statements, he admitted that there are no problems with obtaining consent from President Zelensky or official Kiev to hold negotiations. And he also emphasized that Putin was not ready for these negotiations. He gave several arguments as to why Putin should agree to them. So, what is happening now is what is called preparation for telephone conversation or communication to exchange opinions and exchange greetings. And after that, obviously, preparations for a personal meeting will begin. The new US Secretary of State Marco Rubio and Trump are now quite realistically saying that it's impossible to stop the war in Ukraine quickly. And if I'm not mistaken, Trump said something like this is a huge machine, a flywheel of war that Putin launched. At the very least, he's probably ready to discuss some time frames with Putin. But what Trump said, without addressing Putin directly, we can theoretically assume that he will present the same arguments to him. First, Trump said the war, which was supposed to last a week, has been going on for 3 years. He said that Russia has lost 1 million of soldiers. That is, he has to get Putin to agree that the war must be stopped, and then it is obvious that he will listen to his arguments. And here we move on to the second question. What will Russia demand in exchange for, so to speak, Putin's goodwill to ceasefire? If we try to understand what concessions are being made, there is still little specific. There is a real details here. There is definitely uncertainty, and this is being done deliberately. Because, for example, if these are concessions to occupied territories, then Putin will obviously demand that this be an exchange for a square kilometer in Kursk region. But the question can be posed differently. That is, there are occupied territories of Ukraine, there is occupied territories of Russia. Let's consider the possibility of an exchange. There might be a limit to this compromise somewhere that this is not the territory of 1991, but as of February of 2022. Why not? Especially if it's supposed to be something like, and if you don't want to, then we can do this so that you still agree to our proposals. The question of Ukraine's membership in NATO. It seemed that there is not much enthusiasm, to be honest, in Trump personally, in the current administration to defend Ukraine's right to membership in NATO. But it's also possible to assume that someone will tell the traitors that this is not only about the law of Ukraine, but also about the provisions of the Washington Treaty, which stipulates that any European country has such a right. That is, will this not be Putin's interference in the affairs of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization? But again, these are all assumptions, hypotheses. And how it will actually be, I think with every day or week there will be more and more clarity, especially after Trump took the office and plans to end this war during his term. Currently, there is no information about the preparation of negotiations or the likelihood of such personal meeting between Trump and Zelensky. As for the telephone conversation, in my opinion, at least a telephone contact should take place between the president of Ukraine and the United States before the conversation with dictator Putin. Because this, in addition to the fact that President Zelensky will be given the opportunity to voice some arguments that he has not spoken before, also has a great symbolic significance. That is, Putin must understand that if there is a conversation about Ukraine, then Ukraine knows about it, and Ukraine, at least virtually, must be present there. In the Trump team, As in the previous Biden team, there are, conditionally speaking, doves and hawks. This doesn't mean that those hawks who will advocate a forcible decision are very fond of war and bloodthirsty. There are those people who have an understanding of the consequences of Russia's concessions, not for Ukraine, but for the United States itself. If this group of advisors is more convincing than a group of conditional doves, then of course, at some point, we can say that the United States or Trump administration understands perfectly well what the tragic consequences of even at least a partial victory of Russia in this war can be. So, after careful consideration of all the cons and pros and all the factors, Trump's team understand very well that the war most likely will not end in 24 hours or 100 days. There might be a reason why Trump stopped talking about how many days it will take him to end the war in Ukraine. And here's some of you and few assumptions. The new administration now seems to understand that you cannot stop this war as easily as stopping a train by pulling the chain. The best solution is to completely isolate Russia but eliminating every source of income. And the best way to do this is to reduce Russian energy exports until the Kremlin is begging for a deal. It looks like Trump administration approach is to take over the energy market that has been dominated by Russia for decades. According to the US Energy Information Administration, North America's LNG export capacity will more than double by 2028. This means that during Trump's second term, the US will have unparalleled resources to wield LNG exports as lever to in energy diplomacy. Because of Trump's new threats to impose tariffs, the European Union will most likely have no choice but to start buying more American energy supplies. China and India are still able to purchase discounted Russian LNG, protecting themselves from sanctions by operating outside traditional financial channels. However, if the Kremlin's largest trading partners start switching to other suppliers, it will be a big blow to the aggressor. We already see that India in talks with the United States administration regarding to that. So the US is using its power to reshape the global energy industry to its advantage, and this can help Ukraine by weakening the aggressor economically. Sanctions are likely to become the main levers in negotiating with Russia on peace in Ukraine, while tariffs may be levers pulled with the US European allies. So we will see. Trump team is working on the solution, and probably in the first month or two, we will see a drastic changes in the in talks with United States with talks of United States with Russia and Ukraine, and hopefully it will bring some positive results for Ukraine. Thank you for listening. If you like my podcast, please share with your friends.